Hello and welcome to the January 2020, the first of the new year edition of the Brandwood CKC webinar series. I'm Arthur Brandwood, I'm Director and Principal Consultant at Brandwood CKC, and I'm delighted on this occasion to be joined for the first time since the merger of Brandwood Biomedical with Capital K Consulting by Nancy Stringer, also my Co-Director and Principal Consultant and lead of our Pharmaceutical Regulatory Affairs team. Welcome, Nancy.
Thank you very much, Arthur. I'm delighted to be here and I'm looking forward to discussing where devices and drugs actually might have a lot in common.
Really, when we are considering harmonisation and international regulatory affairs, it's really useful to know who plays with who talks to who. Now, this is a slide I prepared a little while ago. Some of you will have seen this already on all of the different harmonisation organisations and initiatives in medical devices. And it really drives who talks to who, and this slide is particularly looking at what happens here in Australia, and we'll talk later about how Australia recognises some other international assessments, and that's largely driven by its membership of harmonisation groups. Notice that Australia works particularly with those who are closest to it.
And so what do these organisations actually do? Do they have a practical influence?
Yeah, okay, it's interesting. They're all a little different, but mostly what these groups are doing is working together to try to develop a common understanding for the key regulatory processes and develop guidances around that. So, you know, the IMDRF, the International Medical Device Regulatory Forum, is that group of well-established, the more sophisticated regulators, if you like, and they're developing common guidance that's evolved out of the old Global Harmonisation Task Force. Asian Harmonisation Working Party doing a very similar thing, but with a much larger group of regulators, and then most recently the Pan-African Harmonisation Working Party, which, working with the World Health Organization, is starting to build capacity. So again, guidance, but at a different level, building capacity in emerging regulators.
It's interesting looking at that because I think it has a lot of crossover with the regulators that are involved with drugs and how they work together as well.
Yes, it does, and overlaid that to look at how that works, and this is
a lot of commonality.
Where it works in medicine. So the ICH is the primary harmonisation group for medicines.
Indeed.
And it's really interesting that it's got a lot of overlap with the IMDRF, and again, it's the established regulators, but with more involvement with the WHO.
Yes, that's right, and certainly from a drugs perspective, the WHO drives a lot of things.
Yeah.
So we keep hearing about MDR. Is it as bad as everyone says?
So just talking about medical devices, that's the big story, of course, at the moment, the medical device regulations in Europe. So yeah, just let's talk about what's happening there particularly. So this is back in December, there was a session at the European Parliament where here's the Commissioner leading a session on a progress report, if you like, on the implementation of the new medical device regulations in Europe. And it was an interesting time. You can find it on YouTube, actually. But here she was saying, here's what's going on, and how we haven't quite got as many notified bodies as were promised. The Userpays database is very delayed. And what was clearly interesting was there was a long lineup of countries wanting to speak, and all of the representatives from different countries, and 14 of them spoke at this time. And every one of them lined up and said, yes, we note this, and by the way, we call for a new inspection group to conduct a readiness check. In other words, patience is now wearing very thin amongst the member states, and they're calling for an oversight group to be set up to see where things are at and to identify the gaps, and to borrowing from a well-known political phrase, to get MDR done. So look, I don't want to talk anymore about this. Everybody's sick and tired of hearing about MDR, but as will become apparent, it's important because the world has recognized the CE mark as the primary sort of international standard for assessment for a long time, and now that's under question and struggling, and so it's having a ripple effect around the world. We'll talk a bit more about that.
So TGA has been accepting the CE for Australian registrations for years, but they're now recognising other jurisdictions. How does that work?
Yeah, so that's exactly what's happening to this. So the buzzword at the moment is Reliance. You'll hear this phrase more and more in discussions of international regulations and harmonisation. And reliance is where one agency, usually one of the smaller agencies, takes advantage of work already done by another agency, usually one of the biggest ones. So I use this metaphor. This is a picture of my kids walking down the beach, and the smaller agency in the middle is being helped along by the bigger ones, and it's recognizing their work. And TGA does this. TGA for years has recognized CE mark as the means of getting a registration for a medical device in Australia, an inclusion on the Australian Register of Therapeutic Goods. And typically what they've said is, well, if you have a CE mark, a CE certificate, that recognises a European assessment, and because Australia has modelled its regulations very closely on the European, it's essentially the same assessment using the same processes and the same standards. Therefore, we can accept a CE certificate in lieu of an assessment being done here in Australia. And so if you've got that CE, you can present that to TGA, and TGA considers that a CE certificate combines two things. It's an assessment of the product technical file, product compliance. It's also an assessment of the quality systems, because it incorporates a quality systems audit. You can't get the CE certificate without having had the quality systems audit.
So then it's just a reliance on that?
It relies on that. And for the bulk of medical devices, TGA simply accepts the certificate and grants the registration. For the high-risk ones, they will do a thing called an application audit, where they'll do a desktop review of the higher level documents. They'll look at the clinical evidence, for example.
And this is for the class 3s?
And that's largely for class 3s and some class 2Bs.
Okay. Interesting.
That's how that does. But with the struggle that's happening in Europe and the fact that not everybody has a CE, people come from other markets, there's been demands for some time to look at expanding this, to look at other markets. And TGA last year did that. In fact, the year before last, in August of 2018. And it looks like this. So they say what you need is both of those things still, the product assessment and the quality system certificate. And the product assessment is any one of this list of things. So they'll now accept a product review from the United States, from Canada, or from Japan, and notice that it's got to be the equivalent review for the classification. So it doesn't always work, because the classifications don't always line up, but largely works. Works very well for Canada, where we've got almost identical classification rules, and reasonably well for Japan, not so well for the US, because a lot of Class 3 devices in Australia are actually Class 2 and subject to 510K, and you need a PMA to use that. But you also need a quality system certificate, and here's the interesting bit: the TGA has elected to rely upon the MDSAP certificate, which they see as a sort of trusted quality systems examination done from a regulatory viewpoint. So they've required that you bring with this either an MDSAP or for a Japanese approval, bring your Japanese QMS certificate, which is also seen as equivalent because it's an assessment done by the regulator. So here's reliance going on. This is what Australia's doing.
And it's good to see that the other half of the world hasn't been ignored anymore.
Indeed. So, TGA is it's really probably the first one that's gone this far and has formal process in place to recognise assessments from a number of overseas jurisdictions in lieu of their own assessment.
Right. So where do you see this all ending up?
It's interesting, isn't it? So, it's likely, in my view, that we'll see this happen more and more in more jurisdictions. So what does that look like? By the way, before I talk about that, the key thing here is the TGS still makes a local decision. So although they're looking at the evidence, they're not accepting the international decision. They are making their own decision. So they are reviewing the evidence. When it's low risk, they'll almost always just pass it through on the certificate. But they reserve the right to do an application audit at any level, and they always do it for the high risk devices.
And how often are they doing those application audits?
For the class 3s and the active implants, they're doing it for every single application. For 2Bs, for most implantables, and for probably 5 to 10%, probably less than 5% actually of the rest. They'll pick on particular ones where there might be a concern or they're not sure.
Right. Okay.
And occasionally conduct campaigns on particular.
So that's still a reasonable workload for TGA.
Oh yeah, it's still a lot. But TGA as an agency is probably 1/20th the side of the FDA, so there's only so much they can do. where does that go? So I had to think about what does this mean if you're going to adopt this model internationally. And I think what you're going to end up with is you're going to have a number of fairly large regional agencies who will be doing most of the work. And if you're going to have that, where some agencies do most of the work and then other countries piggyback on that and take advantage of it, you're going to end up with a user pays model.
Yeah.
Because the manufacturers making the application are going to have to pay for the work to be done, and then it can be leveraged around the world. So if you have, otherwise you'll have, the FDA and the Europeans, if they don't have a user pays model, they're going to be paying for the rest of the world's regulatory reviews.
So the newer system now with the TGA accepting the American and Canadian evaluations, they don't pay?
Well, TGA doesn't pay. Nobody in Australia pays the Canadians or the Americans directly for the Australian review. TGA, you pay TGA for its work.
Yes.
But they're taking advantage of work that's been done for and paid for elsewhere.
I see.
So what I'm saying is the primary evaluations, we're going to shift to full user pay. And then we're a long way down that track already.
Right.
The FDA charges fairly substantial fees these days. It's still not fully cost recovered, but it's getting more so. TGA is fully cost recovered.
So how much is say a class 3 costing these days?
Well, you see,
in Australia,
if you're going through an application audit pathway where you're bringing a CE mark,
yep,
you'll be paying of the order of $10,000, $12,000 for a TGA to do the desktop review of the high-level stuff.
Interesting.
But you will already have paid maybe $50,000 plus
to get the manufacturer
to get a CE mark, or you'll have paid $25,000 US to get a 510K. So you'll have paid money in the other market already.
Okay, understood.
Yeah. So, we're all working off the same technical standards these days. ISO, IEC standards and so on, they're becoming widely similar across different markets. There's a bit of a hiccup in Europe at the moment in that the harmonisation process for standards where they're normally taken into European standards has broken down. They're just not getting them harmonised, and there's a whole lot of European harmonised standards are now out of date. There's newer versions out in ISO, so that's a bit of a hiccup. I think that will resolve with time. And we're going to see basically recognising international evidence, but always a local decision. That's always going to be the political thing. There will always have to be the local decision.
And I think that makes a lot of sense and has a lot of parallels with drugs as well. I mean, at the end of the day, the manufacturers are going to look to be the slickest organisations they can be, and why would you replicate anything around the world when you can use the same thing?
Indeed,
across the way.
So let's have a look at how it works in medicine. I mean, you see this as what's going on in devices. Now, I think medicines are further developed with harmonisation than devices.
Well,
would that be true?
I think that medicines are forced to be further along because the costs involved are sometimes orders of magnitude larger, particularly when you're looking at a new prescription medicine, NCE, new chemical entity products, where the investment from the companies can be around $1 billion.
So, like
to bring it to the
two
market.
kids sharing the ice cream, speed is of the essence.
Okay, so I guess when we're talking about Australia, what we have is a system that was first put into place for drugs and devices in about 1991, and the focus at that stage was just trying to get things right locally. The need for acceleration of approvals has really been driven a lot by the fact that the internet communicates information now so much more quickly than it ever did before. So it's very easy for someone in Australia to see that a friend that might be in the US has already got access to something that is a year or two away in Australia, and it seems hardly fair, especially when you've got life-saving medicines that need to get
it's the same thing that drives the devices. The average guy in the street in Sydney wants the same medicines and devices that you can get in New York or in London.
Absolutely.
Or whatever.
And at the end of the day, why should we be denied getting access at the same time as everyone else if the manufacturer is willing to make that information available? And certainly in the early days of the legislation that's in place in Australia, approvals for the more complex prescription medicines was taking around or beyond a year, well and truly beyond a year, up to 2 years for getting approvals, which for prescription medicines is all pre-market. And now, up until probably 2018, the average pre-market assessment for prescription medicines took around a year. There was a few different ways that you could try and accelerate it beyond that. There was what was called a Category 2 application versus a Category 1, which is the standard type of application, and Category 2 was said to be able to rely on overseas evaluations. In practice, it really didn't work because it wasn't easy to get access to evaluations, particularly from the FDA, where we'd only have access to redacted evaluation reports.
So the regulators won't share them with each other?
No, very difficult. And so then just prior to 2018, the TGA introduced what we called a pre-submission planning form process, where they tried to streamline the process and try and get the TGA evaluators geared up early to get all of their evaluators in place, so that when the applications came in, everyone was off and running and knew what they were going to get. In practice, it meant that process slowed down the application submission from the manufacturers and sponsors, because there was only particular times in the year when you could submit.
Right, so TGA was sitting right there at the top of the world.
Certainly was, and yet they were only 1% to 2% of the world market.
Yeah, all right. So you know, that's changed. So how practical is that for TGA to make entirely local decisions?
It's incredibly impractical to say that, you know, we don't recognise and make the most of those evaluations from around the world.
Okay. So there's the reason why, isn't it?
And that is the reason why. I mean, in essence, and this is pretty similar, I think, in drugs and devices.
This slide was originally made for devices. So I did this for a Senate inquiry ages ago.
And very nicely done.
And you know, when this slide was made, there were about 1,500 people in the Centre for Devices in the FDA. There's now about 1,800.
Yeah.
There were about 5,000 people employed by all the notified bodies. Back then, there were 80-odd notified bodies, and the 10 biggest probably had close to 5,000 people, big international organisations.
Yeah.
TGA had about 100.
Yeah.
In fact, in a conversation with the TGA afterwards, they said it was a bit difficult. You know, we actually thought when we responded to the Senate inquiry, we at that time had about 70. There's probably about 100 now. It's got a bit bigger, but it's a 20th of the size.
And I guess for the purposes of describing the market relativity, it works the same for
medical devices. There's more. There's 300 or 400 people in the devices program, but in the medicines program. But still, and
the relative size is very similar.
We're talking about tens of thousands of registrations.
Absolutely.
So there's no way that TGA is going to look at each and every one of those.
It can't. It's physically impossible.
And that's what's driving Reliance. So. Let's turn the world the other way up again.
Absolutely. So now we've got a situation where the TGA really is pressured to look at how we can accelerate approvals so that the Australian public is not disadvantaged. And what they've done is tried to properly leverage what's happening in the rest of the world by 175 or even 120, depending on how similar the applications are.
So A and B are the different groups of international regulators?
No, it's the type of data that's submitted. So you need to have, obviously, an identical medicine. Mm-hmm. But sometimes you might have a slightly different data set that's presented. So say you might have only one or two indications. So say, I'm just pulling any indication out of the air, say epilepsy and pain. Yeah. So there's two clinical trials involved. Australia may only look at just one indication, because it might not, that may be the
So
one.
that's the one that we're going to get marked.
And so that's the one that they take the evaluation report for, but it's not exactly the same because it's only part of it.
So A is very similar, and B is
a little bit less similar.
Okay,
So there might be additional manufacturing plants or any of that sort of thing.
But,
so it depends on the similarity.
How does that work I mean, this is fine in theory that you're taking reports from one agency and using them in another, but one thing I know about regulators, they're very set in their ways, and they're different. So how realistic is it to take a report from one agency and use it in another? Does that work, or are there hiccups?
Well, this core evaluation process seems to work quite well. We haven't had a lot of experience, bearing in mind we're only talking 18 months here.
Yeah.
But so far, we can see from what's on the TGA website that evaluations have definitely accelerated from 1 year plus,
right,
down to I think in the best scenario it's 3 to 6 months for approval.
Right.
So certainly in practice it seems to be working, and I think that the evaluators are quite happy to look at their esteemed colleagues from around the world and take it on board.
Okay.
The second pathway that's there is looking at truly shared evaluation. So that's what I was talking about. Quality going to one evaluator, tox going to another evaluator, and clinical going to a different evaluator.
That could be even trickier though when we're getting them to work together.
Absolutely. And there's not many examples of this so far. Having said that, you'll see the group there that have set themselves up have been working together for a long time in the good manufacturing practice environment, so in the manufacturing environment. So now moving into the drug evaluation environment, they've already got a lot of the connections involved.
And that core group is very like the IMDRF group. The IMDRF's got a couple of extra members, but it's like the big group of well-established regulators in medical devices.
Yes.
It's interesting they're working together.
And I must point out that these accelerated pathways are really more focused at the more complex, more akin to your class 3 type device scenarios in the prescription medicine. So new chemical entities and also generics of prescription medicines. It really is work sharing of evaluations. And trying to consolidate the technical questions that come up rather than having a rolling set of questions that might come along and that one set of answers leading to another set of questions, etc. So it's trying to streamline the process.
Streamline it, get it all going together, and then making an announcement at the same time.
In theory, yes, that's right. And what I've put on there is the localised negotiations for labelling, and this is the stuff that stays peculiar to the local country.
Right.
Obviously, we've got our own people with our own languages. In some cases, obviously Japanese isn't highly seen in Australia. So you end up with your local nuances for your local label, which is what our product information.
So that's one other interesting thing when you've got documentation being shared between agencies like this, and you've got particularly Japan involved.
Yes.
And I know Japan requires in medical devices, for the higher risk ones where you're going directly to the PMDA, it's all done in the Japanese language. I presume it's the same for medicines. So that means the manufacturer, the applicant, I presume, is going to be paying for translations here.
Absolutely. In practice, we don't see so many of the Japanese evaluation reports, or I haven't seen very many at all. But it's very common to see European ones, and obviously they're used to having everything in English. But yes, there's always going to be slight differences between what we call the label, what's it called, your piece of your leaflet.
The instructions for use.
The instructions for use. I can't believe I couldn't remember.
The IFU. Yes.
The IFU. So there's always a little bit of difference in that document around the world.
Yes.
And RMPs are risk management plans, which are a fairly new local requirement, and talking about post-market and the commitments that you make post-market.
Yeah. Okay.
All right. So the third option, going to the next. And the third option for getting accelerated approvals for new prescription medicines is parallel process, and that is new to TGA in 2019 and has been led mainly by the Americans at the FDA, but involving other evaluators around the world, including Canada and Australia, and trying to accelerate the evaluation process for important oncology medicines where their patients have often got no other options for treatment. And so the need is greater.
So my understanding, you've got this, the FDA is driving this particular initiative. You've got Canada, Australia, maybe some others. They're all doing their own thing.
They're all doing their own thing.
They're talking to each other in real time and trying to hurry it along as they go.
Absolutely. And with the idea of driving that time frame down to the shortest time frame possible, which based on performance to date, the Americans come through the quickest. Right. So it's trying to shorten those evaluation times for Australia and for America.
What's the practical realities of this, though? Because again, you've got different agencies doing things different ways. They're all in a hurry. They're supposed to be talking to each other in real time across. We know what the time zone difference is like between Sydney and Washington.
It must take you back to your days of being at TGA and thinking about how practical it would be to pick up the phone to your mate overseas and go, "Oh, I'm looking at this. What do you reckon?"
So how does it work in practice?
Look, we've only got 2 examples so far, and I believe it's an incredibly high workload for everyone that's involved. Right. And a lot of flexibility needs to be shown by the regulatory people that are involved in this.
The good thing is they should learn about how each other does stuff, and this can only build trust with time.
Absolutely, and certainly from the experience that our team has had with working with the TGA on these projects, the TGA is very open to dialogue, much more so than any other type of evaluation for prescription medicines.
Alrighty, so let's just wind this up now. We've just come through Christmas and New Year. Too much ham, too much prawns, too much mangoes. We are talking about an Australian summer Christmas here. You say we should be careful what we use.
Well, look, I guess what I'm thinking about is that yet again I'm seeing a drug shortage for a medicine called the EpiPen. And to be a recurring theme for us in Australia because it's happened in 2018, happened again in 2019, right before Christmas, and this is a situation where we've only got one option.
And because we're a small market, we tend to be at the end of the queue when there are shortages.
Absolutely. And there's so many different reasons why we have drug shortages, and it's not unique to Australia. It's happening all around the world for procurement reasons, manufacturing reasons, global acquisitions, political instability, natural disasters. There's so many reasons why these shortages are happening. But in reality, what happens is you've got a poor patient that has an anaphylactic reaction. And especially if we're talking about EpiPen Junior, which is for kids, can you imagine how panicked you would be at Christmas time when your kids just had an anaphylactic reaction and they rushed to go and get one?
Because something they wouldn't normally eat because it's party time.
Yeah, that's right. So I guess this is just a flag to say, there's lots of problems out there, and the medicines that we've created sometimes solve those problems, and sometimes we've created more problems by not even being able to supply. It's a problem that it still doesn't have a lot of answers around the world, but it'll be watch this space, see what regulators around the world can do to work together to try and solve it.
Yes, okay. And what TGA did here was simply allow one batch through, even though it hadn't been fully...
Absolutely. I mean, that's just one of the ways that they can cope with it. They do emergency approvals of medicines that might have been evaluated by an equivalent authority in another jurisdiction, may not have gone through the any evaluation process here, but at the end of the day, if you need a medicine, you need a medicine.
So Nancy, this has been a fascinating discussion. I've really enjoyed comparing the two different worlds, the two different universes of medical devices and medicines. We see far more crossover these days anyway with combination products, and drug device combinations, diagnostics and so on.
And I think that's only going to continue.
More and more personalised medicine world.
Yeah.
We're going to see more and more of this, and it's going to be interesting to see how harmonisation will work as you have to start bringing these things together.
Absolutely.
So thank you to our audience for listening in.
Thanks for having me.
We hope you've enjoyed the webinar. If you've got any questions or feedback, good or bad, let us know. Email to us, help@brandwoodckc.com. We'd be very pleased to come back to you directly and in person if you've got particular questions. And we'll be back again next month with our next webinar around the third week of the month. Thank you again.
See you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.